Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. To start, I just want to thank everybody for joining us for our training today on implicit bias. It is a part of our child abuse and neglect prevention training series. We will also be covering this year human trafficking and social determinants of health. And if you missed our first training on sentinel injuries, that recording is available online. Also go over a few quick announcements and general housekeeping. Our agenda for the day, our welcome and introductions will be done by Dr. Paul McPherson, our medical director on the project. Dr. Angelique McCoy is the main presenter today. She'll be talking about bias, racism, and caring for children. We're going to be watching time, but time allowing, we'll plan for a quick break after that. And then after the break, we'll hear from Dr. Kelly Leiker and Dr. Tenzin Ma. And I'm sure a lot of this is already familiar to you, but we will be muting all lines during the presentation just to avoid any background noise. If you do have any questions throughout, we just ask you to use the chat box because we will be taking scheduled breaks throughout for our moderator to read the questions and get answered. And if there are any questions that we don't have time to get to today, we'll be sure to share those with the presenters and follow up with you afterwards. Our CME statement, the Ohio Chapter American Academy of Pediatrics is accredited by the Ohio State Medical Association to provide continuing medical education for physicians. And this training today is available for 3 hours of CME credit. If you're looking to obtain credit, an evaluation link will be emailed to you after today's presentation. Once you complete the online evaluation, you will receive an email with a PDF to access the printed certificate. And we'll also be following up with presentation materials and resources with you all after today's training. Disclosures, the presenters have no financial relationships to disclose and no off-label products will be discussed today. And lastly, we'd like to thank our program partners. So first of all, thank you to all of our presenters today, as well as our attendees. And also, this presentation is supported by the Office of Criminal Justice Services in the Ohio Chapter American Academy of Pediatrics. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Paul McPherson.
Thank you, Olivia. And I would also like to extend my welcome and appreciation to all those that are participating in today's webinar regarding implicit bias. This is, as you know, an often overlooked, but it's a timely topic to discuss, especially related to the contemporary events that we're experiencing right now. But before we begin, I would like to also express appreciation to each of our 3 presenters. All 3 of them very expert in their understanding of this topic, and we appreciate the time that they have spent preparing and that they will be spending presenting this good information to us. And then finally, a shout out, of course, to the Ohio American Academy of Pediatrics and their staff, and especially to Olivia in managing the IT and logistics requirements for this webinar. So as we begin, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Angelique McCoy. She's a native of the greater Cleveland area and a graduate of Case Western University School of Medicine. After completing her pediatric residency at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C., she returned to the Cleveland area where she practiced at Cleveland Clinic, ultimately serving as section head of general pediatrics at the Stephanie Tubbs Jones Family Health Center in East Cleveland. Currently, she serves as an assistant professor in the Division of General Academic Pediatrics at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital. Her interests include medical student and resident education and equality and inclusion in medicine. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McCoy as the first presenter for our webinar today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for having me. I just want to do a quick audio check. Does everyone hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you great.
Okay, perfect. All righty. So again, thank you, Dr. McPherson, for your introduction. And it is absolutely my honor and my privilege to be here today to speak with you all about implicit bias. I'm also just feeling honored to share the virtual stage with Dr. Leiker and Dr. Ma, and I'm very much looking forward to their contributions to today's presentation as well. First off, somewhat along the lines of what Dr. McPherson mentioned, I do think that discussions about implicit bias are always timely, but especially now. And I just want to acknowledge the times that we are living in currently. I think it has probably been said just about every day in one way or another, but that we are living in extraordinary times. We are dealing with a pandemic and COVID-19 and the trauma and the loss and the just changes to our day-to-day life that has caused, knowing especially that it will have lasting effects in so many different arenas in our communities. But I would argue today, and I think many would agree, that racial inequity has proven to be another pandemic of sorts for us. And while not new, I think we've had the perfect storm of events in dealing with inequities and injustices that we've seen, difficult images to process in the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, in the murders of Breonna Jackson, in the murder of George Floyd. And we know that there have been so many others who have been impacted by violence in that way. And so I think, again, we acknowledge the times, we acknowledge that while implicit bias may seem somewhat a somewhat smaller piece of this big puzzle, I would hope that today our discussion really shows us the power that we have to impact change through addressing implicit bias. As Olivia mentioned, I do not have any disclosures.
Oh, and Dr. Redis, before you get started, I'm going to have you go ahead and share your screen on your end. So I'm going to stop sharing mine so you can pull yours up.
Okay, great. I thought I actually shared it, but I will retry it. Are we good now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So our objectives today are: one, to understand the impact of bias and its role in perpetuating structural racism; to reflect on our role as anti-racist advocates for children and their families; and to explore tools to address bias and racism in our respective workplaces, as well as our communities. And so, as I mentioned, the times that we're living in currently, I think that this era is going to definitely generate a lot of history books, a lot of studies that will come as we kind of dissect what we're going through currently. And when we think about where we'll fall in that story and what our impact will be and how we've responded to it, I wanted to share this story called Our Hidden Biases, which is produced by Picture Alternatives and Project ABC in Los Angeles, that just tries to present a quick and, of course, fictionalized story about where and how and to whom bias can impact. But I think it's a great way to kind of get our heads around the idea of what bias is and most importantly, the impact that it causes on people's lives. So I'll go ahead and play this brief video.
Good morning. How are you?
Cool.
So, can we talk about how you got here?
Yeah, you think I got a funny looking face? No. I just thought it was funny.
Hey kids, I'm telling you guys right here.
Man, we ain't doing nothing.
Boy, right here before I'm cookouts.
So, you didn't do anything?
Nope.
Then what's all this?
Depends on who's reading it, I guess.
Well, looks broken. Skateboarding, huh?
Yes.
Is this the first time you've hurt yourself?
No, I get hurt all the time.
At home?
At home? He hurt himself skateboarding at the park.
Okay, ma'am. I'm going to have a counselor come in and speak with you.
A counselor? For what? He's okay.
Well, I done told you them pricks were gonna put you in the hospital.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, too. A nurse will be in a few minutes to help you check out.
What's up?
That doctor thought I did this to him.
How you doing?
Hi.
It ain't fair.
Fair has nothing to do with this. This is about you taking responsibility for your actions. Look, I know so many young men just like you that didn't do anything. And yet, most of them are in prison.
You don't know me. I ain't going to no prison.
If you don't want to end up in prison, you're going to have to get some new priorities and probably some new friends too. Look, you're not getting any younger.
Sorry about that. We'll get back to where we were.
Look, I know so many young men just like you that didn't do anything. And yet, most of them are in prison.
You don't know me. I ain't going to no prison.
If you don't want to end up in prison, you're going to have to get some new priorities and probably some new friends too. Look, you're not getting any younger. You need to get an education so you can get a good job.
Like you just like everybody else. You think you see, but you don't see. You see what you want to see.
I see what's in this folder. It shows me what you've been doing.
I ain't doing nothing.
I am not doing anything. Stop.
I ain't doing nothing.
I'm not doing anything. And yes, you were. Get to the timeout chair. Now, please. I'm sorry. I am so sorry.
Okay. And so, again, the video is fiction. It tries to wrap up a story pretty quickly, but I think, again, some of the points and the questions that it poses at the end are really important to consider as we think about how we may perpetuate bias and when and where that happens and how it impacts the individuals that we serve. So I will say, as we start to talk more broadly about bias, that today we will be focusing more specifically on bias as it relates to the Black community and health disparities within the Black community. Obviously, bias is a big issue, and it is not one that we could ever fully cover in an hour. But we know that many other marginalized communities are impacted by bias as well, and that we have to use the tools that we gain today and the concepts that we discuss to consider our roles in other bias situations as well. But again, today we'll be focusing on racial bias, in part because I think many of us in our communities recognize that we have a large African American or Black community. There's also a pretty solid body of evidence as it relates to bias and its impact on education and on health and the justice system for the Black community. And there are growing bodies of evidence for the LGBTQ community, for the Latinx community, for immigrant communities, and so on. And so I think, again, today this is not intended to be excluding any groups at all, but just to really focus in and hone in on a specific community. But please, again, know that moving forward, there's so many more conversations to be had. So again, bias in a broader sense is basically just a favorable or unfavorable perception of a group of people and its members. And this bias can be explicit or implicit. Our discussion today, of course, will be on implicit bias, but I think it's important to discuss briefly explicit bias just to be able to distinguish the two and to see in some ways how they are connected or might be connected. So explicit bias is what I call the in-your-face bias. It is conscious, it is self-reported, and it is intentional. And so whether the words or actions that come from explicit bias are done in private or done externally, the person who holds those biases is aware of them. A few examples of explicit bias are represented in the images here. We know, again, that many communities are marginalized, and if we think about some of the challenges that the LGBTQ community has faced in terms of not being granted their basic human rights, their basic rights as citizens, to be serviced just like everyone else. You know, we've seen signs like these where we reserve the right to refuse service or admittance to anyone, very blatantly excluding certain communities. And not just in stores or bakeries, but also in the legislative world, we have to really be mindful of the changes that may impair the rights to, again, the rights that we all should have for that specific community. The image to the right is from 2017 in Charlottesville. At the time, I actually worked at the University of Virginia Children's Hospital and was on vacation that weekend. I lived a little bit outside of Charlottesville, but I can tell you that the images and knowing that they were in spaces that I walked to go to lunch and where I sat to have conversations with students and my colleagues on campus was very chilling. And to know that there were individuals there that very clearly expressed their desire to have certain communities gone from their space, what they deemed as their space, was chilling. And particularly on a campus that we know was built by enslaved Africans. UVA actually just recently established a memorial on campus, which is gorgeous, but as they tackle with all of the challenges of their history, and then to have this event happen and to have that happen for the broader Charlottesville community, really shook not just Charlottesville, but obviously shook our country, and it's still something that we talk about today. And again, a very obvious but clear example of explicit bias. Another more recent bias that we are seeing is the bias that many Americans of Asian descent have encountered just with these false statements of culpability about their involvement in or perpetuation of the COVID-19 pandemic. And just thinking about not just the rude or ignorant statements that is, but the truly racist statements that have come out regarding that community. And again, these are overt statements owned by the people that say them and are clearly explicit. So what's more challenging is implicit bias, because implicit bias is not a conscious part of our day-to-day movement through the world. It is unconscious, it is activated spontaneously, and can be viewed as mental shortcuts. And these shortcuts are created by stereotypes that we've all been exposed to through the course of our lives, experiences with communities, be it direct or indirect, oftentimes part of our kind of broader culture, the media that we see, and we make these subconscious mental groupings of people and assign value and assign judgment to those groups. And so while we're not aware of this, these biases absolutely can impact our behaviors and interactions of people in these groups. And particularly for those of us who are working in high stress and fatiguing fields, which very oftentimes in social services, we find ourselves feeling this way, this type of bias can be augmented by stress and by time constraints, things that we all deal with on a day-to-day basis. And again, another challenge of implicit bias is that it is not typically in alignment with our explicit egalitarian beliefs. So these are not things that we would say out loud. We would oftentimes say the exact opposite and truly, honestly feel that to be the case. But again, not really being able to account for how we respond and how we act when the implicit biases come into play. I highlighted at the end that implicit bias is malleable. It is changeable. But the first step, of course, in changing implicit bias and impacting that is by acknowledging it. So how do we do that? Well, we start with conversations like this. And again, just really thinking about this balance of this reflective part of us and this automatic subconscious part of us. Dr. Greenwald and Dr. Banaji, who have written the book Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People, speak very clearly, and I think in a great, very relatable way to implicit bias. And one of the concepts that they talk about, again, is this reflective and conscious part of us, which not the same exactly as explicit bias, because this can be a positive conscious part of us, the things that we really try to do and speak to. But again, the automatic and subconscious piece of our decision making and our thoughts. They refer to this as mind bugs, which are ingrained habits of thought that lead to error in how we perceive, remember, reason, and make decisions. And so again, how do we figure out what these are? How do we identify this? And so Dr. Greenwald, along with his team in 1998, created the implicit association test. And this is a validated instrument, and it measures the strength of associations between concepts and evaluations. Those concepts they're varied. Actually, there are quite a few tests if you go to the site for those that may not have been already, but they are concepts including racial and ethnic groups, religious groups, sexual orientation, physical characteristics such as obesity, mental health, and so on. And what they do is they take these concepts and pair them with evaluations, good or bad, and words that kind of fall into the category of good or bad. And in the midst of the test, it kind of measures the timing of your ability to associate the concepts and the evaluations. And so ultimately what the IAT can do for us is that we can reflect our mental dissonance. It can reflect that piece of us that we oftentimes have a very hard time identifying, which is that difference between our explicit values and our implicit bias. Okay, there we go. So when we talk about implicit bias, it honestly can drum up a lot of feelings, because I think most of us know, especially in the fields that we are in, that we chose these fields to serve people, to treat people fairly, and to treat people equitably. And so the idea of tackling bias that may be hard to see, but also challenges our self-identity as a good person can be especially tough. And so I want to share this brief video from Dolly Chug's TED Talk on The Person You Mean to Be. And she is the author of The Person You Mean to Be, How Good People Fight Bias. And I think she explains how we can approach this really well. So I'll go ahead and play this video.
I'm a social scientist. I study the psychology of good people. And research in my field says many of us care deeply about feeling like a good person and being seen as a good person. Now, your definition of good person and your definition of good person and maybe the taxi driver's definition of good person, we may not all have the same definition. But within whatever our definition is, that moral identity is important to many of us. Now, if somebody challenges it, like they question us for a joke we tell, or maybe they say our workforce is homogenous or a slippery business expense, we go into red zone defensiveness a lot of the time. I mean, sometimes we call out all the ways in which we help people from marginalized groups, or we donate to charity, or the hours we volunteer to nonprofits. We work to protect that good person identity. It's important to many of us. But what if I told you this? What if I told you that our attachment to being good people is getting in the way of us being better people? What if I told you that our definition of good person is so narrow, it's scientifically impossible to meet? And what if I told you the path to being better people just begins with letting go of being a good person? Now, let me tell you a little bit about the research about how the human mind works to explain. The brain relies...
Okay. And so if you haven't, by the way, seen this TED Talk, I would recommend it. I think, again, Dr. Chuck does a really great job of talking about bias and our approach to addressing it in our own lives. But from that video, I want to just, again, acknowledge that I think part of doing better is just acknowledging that we can do better and letting go a little bit of that good person identity, as she says. And so as we talk about some of these concepts, and if there's that sense of not feeling good about ourselves, I think we just need to acknowledge the discomfort, lean into the discomfort, and then just be ready to learn from it and shift our focus back to those who are impacted. I think also I just want to say, always my spoiler alert for this talk is that we all have biases. No one is exempt. No one is without them. We all have them. We are all impacted by the society and the culture that we live in. And so knowing that we all start from that space, I think that we all have work to do. So speaking of work to do, I wanted to share a brief case before we go into some more of the evidence behind implicit bias and some of the studies that have shown how it can impact children in their lives. But this is a patient that I saw last year I initially saw with my resident and medical student. Actually, they saw him first. And I was working in our continuity clinic, and the patient came in with a chief complaint of vomiting. And so the basic story is that he's a 17-year-old young man, presented to clinic with episodes of repeated vomiting that lasted several days at a time, sometimes having intermittent abdominal pain with it, but no diarrhea, no urinary frequency, wasn't urinating all the time, no fever, really no signs of infection with his story. Of note, he lives with his mother, is in the 10th grade, but absolutely hates school, which he expressed very clearly, and admitted that he smoked marijuana 5 to 7 times a week, most weeks, but denied any other drug use. So my resident and my medical student went in to see him first, and my resident came back. Great resident, by the way, crazy smart, great energy, but was just frustrated. Kind of slumped into the chair, and they said, well, he seems otherwise okay. Other than this vomiting, I really think that it is just hyperemesis, which is excessive vomiting due to marijuana use. And if he didn't have this disgusting habit, he wouldn't be going through this. And then the resident kind of threw up their hands and was just kind of done with it and kind of waited for me to share my piece. And so my first reaction to my resident was that, one, I hear your frustration. However, let's try not to ascribe judgment in this situation. And I even shared with her that, yes, I, probably like many other people, know some people who have smoked marijuana and they're not disgusting. You know, they've got so many wonderful attributes. And so not to use that as a judgment criteria for this patient. The next question I asked, though, was, well, why? Like, did he say why he smokes weed almost every day? And they really had not tackled that question in the room, really kind of focused more specifically on the vomiting and the cause of the vomiting, not the cause of what they thought was causing the vomiting, which was the marijuana use. And so we talked a bit, and we looked into the patient's chart and realized that this patient had had multiple visits with the diagnoses of adjustment reaction and depressed mood, and had previously, about a year or so prior, been referred to therapy And then on a follow-up visit found that therapy wasn't going well for him. He said it wasn't working. He didn't feel like the person understood him. And so he stopped going. And so then we decided to go back into the room. I said, well, let's explore this further, because clearly this young man has had a lot of issues. And even our medical student actually spoke up and said, well, probably maybe self-medicating. And so I said, yes, let's go explore this. And so in the room, this young man, 6 foot plus African-American young man, kind of physique of a basketball player. Many people would probably look at him and assume this tough guy. But he was very clear about what was going on, very honest about his marijuana use. But when we asked him why, he said it was the only thing that made him feel better. And when we explored that further, he said that he hated school because he didn't do well. He didn't feel like he was cared about. He was struggling and he would get frustrated and he was embarrassed. When we talked about his mood, he acknowledged depression. He acknowledged previous thoughts of suicidal ideations. And again, reiterated that marijuana was really the only thing that made him feel better. And so we went on from there and talked with him at length and were able to try to reconnect him with some mental health services. And ultimately, we were able to have a conversation about how we mustn't rush to judgment about our patients and other people that we come into contact with, and that there's a story behind every situation, and that we all have that human part of us that is impacted by something in life, and that we've got to kind of get to the core of that piece. And so it ended up being a really great learning opportunity for our resident and for our medical student. And then thankfully we were able to be more impactful, hopefully, for our patient. So again, as we kind of start to move forward, I want us to think about the biases that we have. And if we can't really identify them, think about how I can identify those biases. And we talked about the AAT. Think about the potential impacts of the biases that we have on others. And think about what you can do as a bystander when witnessing this bias in our workplace or communities. And then we'll think also about what tools we can employ to address our biases. And we'll talk more about that moving forward. My last little reflection I just want to share, again, because I think this is a powerful statement, that is, as we go through this and again tackle bias, if we get caught up in that sense of guilt, to use that guilt for impact. So Audre Lorde, who has since passed away, but a prolific poet and writer and speaker, the previous poet laureate of New York State, wrote that guilt is a response to one's own actions or lack of action. And if it leads to change, then it can be useful, since it is then no longer guilt, but the beginning of knowledge. And so I just charge all of us, myself included, to use any guilt that we may have to begin knowledge and also begin action. So let's talk about how implicit bias and racism interact, the interplay between the two of them. And in starting to do that, I think it's important to begin with some fundamental concepts, particularly what is race? And I think race plays obviously a huge part in our society, but really what is the story behind it? And ultimately, race is a social construct. It was historically used to classify people from different parts of the world and ultimately establish dominance of some social groups over others. Race is not a meaningful biological category. And Dr. Francis Collins, who is the former director of the Human Genome Project and currently the director of the NIH, has noted that at the level of the genome, we as human beings are 99.9% the same. And so when we think about differences in health, we really have to say that 0.1% is likely not the source of our disparities. And we have to think of other factors that impact that. And Dr. Kamara Jones, a former president of the American Public Health Association, wrote similarly that this variable of race is not a biological construct that reflects innate differences, but a social construct that precisely captures the impacts of racism. And along those lines, race is not ethnicity or nationality or culture. Those are different entities. But as we think about race, and then we think about how we study it and how we talk about it, particularly in healthcare, and when we identify other disparities in society, we need to keep in mind that it is indeed a social construct. And so racism, expanding that, racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks. And that system can unfairly disadvantage some individuals and communities and unfairly advantage other individuals and communities. And ultimately, when we are experiencing racism as a society, we are really all losing out. We are basically wasting human resources, wasting the light and the talents and the creativity of others in our communities. So structural racism, which I'm sure many of you have heard this term, especially more recently, really refers to the system in which public policy, institutional practices, cultural representation, and other norms work together to reinforce and perpetuate racial group inequity. And we can see this in education, despite the fact that the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education passed the Supreme Court. We know that schools are just about similarly segregated now than they were even in the 1950s. And part of this relates to housing and subprime loans and purposeful segregation of communities and neighborhoods as people moved to different parts of cities. And similarly, and so forth and so on, we see that impact in the environment in terms of clean communities, clean, safe communities, even access to healthcare facilities, and voice, basically meaning our representation, our ability to vote, and our access to vote. And when we think about other parts of ourselves, because obviously race is not all of who we all are, there are so many other intersecting factors. So gender presentation, sexual orientation, immigration status, religion, and so forth. And so for those who are in marginalized groups and actually are in more than one marginalized group, we think about that intersectionality, as Kimberly Crenshaw has coined, and that multiplicative impact of racism on those individuals. This is another schematic that just speaks to kind of what I mentioned, and I won't read all the way through it, but as you can see, it really is a vicious cycle. We know that race was created to justify enslaving people from Africa here in our country, and that was used to drive the economy of our country. We know that even after slavery, Jim Crow laws really disenfranchised those communities who were supposedly now free. And in that disenfranchisement, we see people in segregated communities with differential resources. And subsequently, the narrative changes, and the narrative becomes that these communities somehow or another got themselves there, when in actuality, there was a whole structure of policy and practice and law that put them there. And so that cycle continues and continues onward, as you can see here in the schematic. Another way to look at this is to kind of think about racism on multiple levels. So in that cycle that I just showed you, we even, those of us who are in marginalized communities, those of us in the Black community, sometimes even have to deal with that intrapersonal kind of within ourselves type of racism, that internalized racism, where you start to believe all the things that you hear about the Black community, even when you may not even have that about yourself, but just kind of accept it. And then where we fall into play oftentimes is at the interpersonal and institutional levels. So in our interpersonal interactions with our clients or our patients, and then in our institutions, especially if we are in leadership roles where we can impact policy and reflect upon who's receiving care and who's at the table and who is actually represented as we decide the course of the work that we do. I apologize, there's a helicopter in the background here at the hospital, so I apologize if you can hear that noise. And so this idea, this concept of structural racism and it impacting health specifically is becoming more and more, I think our society is becoming more and more aware of the impact of this on health in particular. And we can see that now as the city of Cleveland, the city of Columbus, Indianapolis, Boston, I think others have begun to declare racism as a public health crisis because we know of that history of structural racism that has caused many of the disparities that we see. And our organization, the American Academy of Pediatrics, just last year released a policy statement on the impact of racism on child and adolescent health. And while I won't go into a lot of details about it right now, I do think that, again, it's a beautifully worded and wonderfully evidence-based document that I think for those that may not have seen it yet, I would highly recommend that you use it. But we will circle back to that to talk some more about some of the impact that we can be responsible for in our own personal spaces. So we take all this talk about racism and bias and we think, well, wow, like we work with children. And clearly children have to be protected just by the fact that they are children. and have the innocence of children. But I would argue, and I think the evidence will argue, that that is not always the case. And so many of you may be familiar with the Yale Child Study. And in this study, the researchers had teachers as their subjects, teachers specifically who worked in early childhood education, as well as some student teachers as well. And the group was tasked to watch a 6-minute video featuring 30-second clips of children playing. And their task in watching that was to press enter every time they noted a behavior that could become challenging. What was the case, though, is that in this video is that really none of the behavior that the children exhibited was challenging. There was no challenging behavior in the 6-minute video. But what the researchers did is they had vision tracking devices and they watched who the teachers were watching. And as you can see from this graph, that the boys, by and large, boys in general, were watched much more closely than the girls. And specifically, the Black boys were watched 42% of the time compared to 34% of the time for white boys. So the thought being that when looking for challenging behavior, the teachers looked to the Black boys. And this was a diverse group. There were also Black teachers in the group, and Black teachers also fell into this. And I think that goes back to some extent thinking about intrapersonal racism. But one of the other ideas that the researchers posed was that in the other part of the study where they shared stories about children having behavioral issues and then shared part of their background story, their home issues and challenges there, Black teachers, well, actually teachers in general of the same race of the child, were found to have more empathy when the student was the same race. And so there is this differential sometimes in who people connect with. And so what happens with this? So we know they're watching them more closely. What is the impact, if any, of this? Well, what we know is that Black children make up about 19% of preschool enrollment, but comprise 47% of preschoolers who have been suspended 1 or more times. And when they delve into this even more so, we can see that the infractions that the children are being reprimanded for, that children are being reprimanded for, are very similar. And despite that, there is this discrepancy in the number of suspensions, particularly related to Black boys. And as children get older, you can imagine that this can become even more of a challenge for them. So the Essence of Innocence is a study by Philip Goff and his colleagues, and it was a multi-test study, but the first part of the study surveyed 123 college students who responded to questions regarding their perceived innocence of various ages of children who were white, Black, or de-identified. And Black boys were significantly seen as less innocent than their peers. The second study surveyed 59 college students who noted the perceived age of a boy when they were given the description of a crime, which was either a misdemeanor or a felony, and then given an image of the boy, be it white, Latino, or Black, who supposedly had committed the crime. And in that study, they found that African American children were seen as 3 to 4 years older than their peers. And I think we've seen this in other settings, even in the case of Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old when he was shot while he was playing with a toy gun. Much of what was discussed about him in the trial and even in the officer's description of the situation was that he seemed older because he was so big. And they talked a lot about that in that court case. And it's not just Black boys. Black girls also are dealing with differential disciplinary actions, both in school and juvenile justice settings. And studies have shown, particularly the study Girlhood Interrupted, which is based at Georgetown Law Center for Poverty and Inequality, showed that Black girls were perceived as less innocent, more independent, less needing of nurturing and protection, and more aware of adult topics and sex. And this is the last video I'm going to show just because I think it really speaks to how these perceptions impact these young ladies and these girls and how our perceptions of them impact their perceptions of themselves.
This video went viral, but incidents like this can be found throughout America. The criminalization of Black girls in schools disrupts one of the most important factors in their lives: education. I would like for schools to become locations for healing so that they can become locations for learning.
These young women, they are pushing up against racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, xenophobia.
I've asked girls if they felt that teachers were afraid of them. And some girls will say yes, their teachers are afraid of them. And then they laugh, because why would an adult be afraid of a child?
And the word of the week is condone. Condone us.
As a nation, talking about the school to prison pipeline for Black boys and Latino boys, but absent of that conversation,
what we learned, Emma,
was how girls of color and Black girls in particular were being impacted.
What that then did was send the message that what's happening to girls isn't necessarily a crisis.
What's crazy is that there are 300 girls in this school. Good majority of girls here are Black, and they go through a lot. And I know they go through a lot because they're Black. They live in America.
My teacher got super duper mad and dragged me by the chair, yelled at the other kids to move, and dragged me all the way outside.
Oftentimes, I'm going to say what they don't see is they just refuse to see Black girls as being somebody able to be harmed. My harm can actually be like, come at me and I'm coming for you.
I was known for fighting. I had a big mouth. Like, I would just put up a front like I was so angry. But deep down inside, I was really depressed and I was really sad.
We know there's a higher number of assaults against Black girls. They're more likely to be trafficked. They're more likely to be molested. They're more likely to fall into so many different categories that affect their ability to learn.
I actually got caught up with a pimp for 3 days, but I knew it was so wrong. I just didn't want to be here no more.
You push a girl out of school and you push her into the streets. You push her into violence. You push her into trauma.
Whereas I felt like we needed to approach any of our intervention from they are capable, they are strong, they are vulnerable.
It matters.
They are worth protecting.
Okay. And so we know that if we can see bias and its impacts in education for Black children, we can see it in other spaces as well. And so we'll talk about how we see disparity, inequity, and bias, and the role of bias in healthcare. And so to start briefly, I just wanted to again, provide some background, foundational knowledge on what disparity is and what health inequity is. And this current quote, this is actually from Dr. Tina Chang, who is a pediatrician and wrote Starting Early, a Life Course Perspective on Child Health Disparities quite a few years ago, back in 2009. But the statement was so true that disparity should be defined not simply as a difference, but as an inequitable difference that is potentially systematic and avoidable. And so with the truth in that statement, we now see that health disparity is more defined as really just a difference in health care or health outcomes, whereas health inequity really speaks to that potentially systematic and avoidable difference, that unjust difference that we see. And health disparities, and particularly the role of bias in healthcare disparities, really came to the forefront in 2003 when Unequal Treatment was published. And this was the Institute of Medicine's report on healthcare disparities and how bias played into that. And although there were some studies already in place that they explored, it really pushed to have us as the medical community address and explore and address healthcare disparities more significantly. Child health care, though, at that time really had not been explored much and really only was discussed in 5 of the 103 studies that was in that book. This is an image, a graph from the book, and speaks to what causes disparity. And so in this conversation, by no means, of course, are we saying that the only difference that exists, the only reason that there exists disparities in healthcare is because of bias. But we do see, like, it is an important chunk. And in the same way that we think about clinical appropriateness and practice and care guidelines, we need to also think about what we can impact, and that is biases and stereotyping in medicine. A few adult examples before we segue into examples for children of implicit bias and its impact. This is a study that was published in 2016, conducted at UVA. And the first part of the study actually found that white laypersons, so non-medical staff, who had stronger false beliefs about biological racial differences reported lower pay for Blacks as compared to whites. And some of those biological differences they ascribed to were Black people having less nerve endings and Black people having thicker skin and white people having bigger brains. And so for those that had carried those beliefs, they were 73% more likely to report lower pay for Blacks compared to whites when given scenarios. And then more concerningly, the researchers studied white UVA medical students and residents, and 50% of them reported similar beliefs as the laypersons from part 1. And obviously the impact is even greater there, because if they have those beliefs about race, they would be more likely to rate a patient's pain as less than white patients, and ultimately that would impact their care. The author Lang and her colleagues in calling out implicit bias as a harm in pediatric care also talked about other clinical implications more specific to pediatrics, and talked, of course, about health disparities, but also talked about stereotype threat, which we see actually as a feeling that individuals who are at the receiving end of bias oftentimes challenge themselves with trying not to be part of this stereotype, and sometimes not saying things that are true to avoid being viewed in a negative sense. But ultimately what that does is breed additional mistrust between the patient and the physician. It oftentimes leads to care that is not optimized because there's this hesitance to share everything about themselves for fear of being stereotyped. And then I won't go into a lot of detail, but racial microaggressions we also can be guilty of in our patient care settings. And these can be, for example, I had a patient who once was admitted, and then she came back on her follow-up. She said, "Oh my goodness, like the doctors in the hospital thought they were like giving me so much praise because my baby shots were up to date." And she's like, "Well, aren't the shots supposed to be up to date?" And so what was kind of presented as a moment of praise, an expression of praise to her, really was taken the opposite, because she was being stereotyped as a Black mom from my practice, which was in East Cleveland, Ohio. And the assumption was this, that, well, your shots must not be up to date. And so that was how she took that. And then other times, environmental microaggressions can come into play, where we have patients that receive care in spaces that don't feel welcoming to them. There might not be any pictures of any people of color or any images that reflect their community on those walls, and that can make them feel a lower sense of belonging. And for people whose first language is not English, or who are not yet fluent in English, oftentimes they may be viewed as being less intelligent or less educated, and not giving the benefit of the doubt about having the knowledge base to, one, ask questions and to understand their issues, but get kind of subprime care because the expectations are set so much lower for them just because they don't speak the English language. And then lastly, looking at another adult study, just to re-emphasize that racism, but not race, can cause disparities. This is a multi-site international study that compared blood pressure in populations of African descent. There are about 500 participants who are fairly young, 25 to 49 years of age, in the US, in Jamaica, in Ghana, in Seychelles, and in South Africa. And the the blood pressure was significantly higher in the USA and in South Africa, the only two multiracial societies with high levels of racism. And I think, again, that speaks to racism, not race, and that we are all of African descent being the play here in this situation. And then when we think about Black women, we also see that the literature shows that perceived racial discrimination can impact their health as well, particularly in adverse birth outcomes. And that's what we'll talk about a bit now. And so many of us are aware that there are very significant health disparities as it relates to maternal mortality and pregnancy-related complications. And so African American women are 40% more likely to deliver prematurely, and they are 3 to 4 times more likely to die due to pregnancy-related complications. And this is regardless of education and income. In 2016, and these numbers are slightly different now, have improved a little bit, but per the CDC, the national Black infant mortality rate was 2 times greater than that of Latinx, white, and Asian infants. And when we look at Ohio specifically, the most recent report from 2018 shows that the Ohio infant mortality rate was 6.9, which was decreased from 7.2 in 2017. However, the rate for Black babies was still significantly high, although it had finally decreased for the first time in 5 years from 15.6 to 13.9. Black infants, though, are still 2.5 to 3 times more likely to die than white babies. And very often that death is related to prematurity-related conditions, which circles back to the fact that Black women are much more likely to deliver prematurely. And this is from First Year Cleveland, who's working to tackle infant mortality in Cuyahoga County and the Cleveland area. But of the 120 babies that died in the first year of life in 2019, the vast majority of those babies disproportionately were Black. And obviously we wouldn't want any baby, any family to ever have to deal with this. But when we see that only 38% of the babies born in Cuyahoga County were Black, but 71% of them that died were Black, we see a huge, huge disparity there. And for children, we can even see disparity in other chronic illnesses. Probably one of the most chronic illnesses in children is asthma. And African American children have a higher prevalence of asthma, have higher rates of ED visits, ER visits, and higher rates of asthma-related mortality. But for some reason, which while the study wasn't able to say exactly what it was, could at least suggest the question, why do we see a decreased likelihood of Black children being prescribed a controller medication for asthma when it's indicated? And why do they have lower rates of referral to pulmonary subspecialists? And this study from Monica Goyle from Children's National Washington, D.C. looked at racial disparities in pain management of children with appendicitis in emergency departments. And actually, of all the children, probably less children than should have happened received analgesia of any kind. So only 56.8% of these children received analgesia, which, as we all know, appendicitis is very painful. And only 41% received opioids. Black children, however, had about 1/5 the odds of receiving opioids for pain than white children. And so when we look at these graphs from that study, this is analgesia for moderate pain, and we can see that white children were significantly more likely to receive analgesia, and although still less likely to get opioids than regular analgesia, so like ibuprofen or Tylenol, still a very significant discrepancy. On the other hand, for severe pain, Black children actually were given something, but still much, much less likely to get opioid analgesia, which in the instance of appendicitis might have been appropriate. And this study here is from Tiffany Johnson, who is a researcher on implicit bias. And oftentimes, just as a plug for her, because I think she's an awesome speaker and does great work, but she oftentimes speaks at the national AAP conferences. And while it is virtual this year, if you're able to hear her speak, I think it would be a great experience for you and a great learning opportunity. But she looked at physician implicit bias as it relates to children, because again, we see these disparities. Is this because of bias? And what she did was administer the IAT to 91 residents prior to an ED shift, so prior to being tired and fatigued. But what she found was that there was moderate pro-white, and anti-Black bias. And this did not differ if it was a pediatric resident or ED resident or family practice resident. And this, again, is pre-shift, so before fatigue. And so taking in all that information, I think one of the things that we have to use as motivation from this information is to do better. And this is just a brief quote from Nelson Mandela that says that there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. And I'm pretty confident that we all agree with that. So what can we do? So first of all, we attend sessions like this where we talk about implicit bias and we learn a bit more about it and why it is and how we can tackle it. And part of doing that is re-educating ourselves. I've listed a few resources here, but there are others. But modules, online modules, one based at Georgetown, one based at Stanford, racialequitytools.org is another that has lots of resources where you can just explore your own thoughts and then think about, tools that relate to you and your work and how you can employ them. And while it may seem a little fluffy, seeking commonality and intergroup contact is really important because ultimately that helps provide some counter stereotyping. Many of us are really kind of living in very homogenous spaces. And so whether it's at work, whether it's in our communities, whether it's in our place of worship, we oftentimes are not in the most diverse spaces on a consistent basis, particularly the people that are closest to us. And obviously that's not everyone, but many of us. And so to really kind of step outside of those boundaries and start to really interact more with one another, to be able to break down those stereotypes can in turn help us break down the implicit biases that we have. And ultimately just really putting ourselves in others' shoes, seeking empathy in the situations that we encounter. And I showed this iceberg. There are tons of iceberg graphics out in the world, but I think they're important because it really does speak to all the unseen aspects of ourselves, all the unseen aspects of our identity. And we may see a person's age, we may see a person's gender or what, their gender expression and their race on the surface, but there's so many ways in which we can connect with one another. And so I think just, again, delving deeper into the stories that we hear from our patients and our families and our clients and thinking about the many, many ways that we have to connect with one another. And again, the ways in which we are more the same than we are different. A couple of quick mnemonics are this one, which is very easy to remember, and that it is called Implicit. And basically, I won't go through it in depthly. I'll just touch on take two, which basically just kind of gives ourselves some grace, right? We talked a bit about being introspective and being mindful of our situations, slowing ourselves down when we are encountering a situation that may cause us to jump to a conclusion. But at the end of the day, we all will make mistakes and we all may find ourselves in spaces where we didn't do the right thing, or at least we're about to not do the right thing, and to give ourselves an opportunity to do more. So to circle back, know that cultural humility is a journey, it is not an endpoint, and that we can continue to learn and do better. The pause method is another, and basically, again, kind of repeating some of the ideas we've talked about already, but stopping to pay attention to what surprises you or makes you feel uncomfortable in a case. So if you are with a patient and you are kind of finding yourself kind of bristling to maybe some of what's being said, as you step out, take that moment, think about what it is that you're feeling, what made you uncomfortable about that patient, and what else could be going on. And again, acknowledge those reactions. We have to acknowledge them to be able to address them and think about what we were thinking to get there. And then as we do that, we may not have time to list them in that moment, but at least think through them and then basically think of a way to deal with it in a more empowering way for both you as well as for your patient. I also just want to briefly mention the importance of workforce diversity. In medicine in particular, we know that those who are underrepresented in medicine, Latinx community, African American community, we are oftentimes a very, very small percentage of the physician workforce in places. And sometimes there are no physicians of color in these workspaces. But I would just encourage us to think about if we are in spaces where we teach residents or teach students or, are in spaces where we are recruiting people, to think about, how we can do better in boosting our workforce diversity, and then ultimately retaining that diversity as well. We know that physicians of color are more likely to work in underserved communities. If there is linguistic or experiential concordance, there are oftentimes better patient outcomes. And then greater patient satisfaction is reported when there is patient and physician race or ethnicity concordance as well. And so again, I know we're probably getting closer to time, but I just wanted to circle back briefly to the impact of racism on child and adolescent health policy statement by the AAP. And I won't go into all the details, but basically at the end of the statement, it goes over ways in which we can begin to be agents of change in our respective communities and spaces. And so one is to optimize clinical practice, to make that space and that environment welcoming, to ensure that cultural humility is a goal and an ongoing effort by your staff, and then to ensure that we provide appropriate language services for families. And again, continue the education. I think that is really a key piece. Workforce development is another piece of that, which I just mentioned. And then working on optimizing those systems, that greater part. So we as pediatricians know that we have a voice. We are often at the tables that our patients are not at, and we can help impact and provide context to those who are in the positions to make policy and to create legislation that will impact our communities. And if we can see that there may be inequitable legislation there, we have the power at least to speak our voice and potentially to impact change. And then lastly, the policy statement talks about optimizing research. So we talked about several studies, but the reality is that there is still a ton of research that can be done. One, to see how we can most effectively, we talk about things that we can do, but how effective they are so that we can ensure we're doing the right things. And really to explore, again, other marginalized communities and how bias impacts them so that we can continue to do the same across the board. This is a reading list. I know most recently, if you go on Amazon, a lot of these books are sold out, but these are some books that I think really speak to how to be anti-racist, how to be change agents, and how to address the internal challenges that we all have, whether it's intrapersonal racism as a Black person, where we've internalized some of the things that we see across us, or if it's more interpersonal or institutional racism. So take home points today is that number one, again, we all have biases. No one is exempt from this. No one is perfect. We are all, as Dr. Dolly Chook would say, good-ish. We can be good people, but we can be better. Implicit biases contribute to structural racism, and that racism, not race, causes disease and health disparities. And ultimately, we have the power. We are in positions to be able to speak our voice, to change ourselves, but also to change our institutions and our policies. And in doing so, the hope is that those who feel unseen will start to be seen, and that we can all advocate for that, not just those in the marginalized communities, but all of us as a larger and greater community. And so lastly, I'll just leave you with this is a quote by Maya Angelou, and she states that you should do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ritas McCoy. That was great. I am going to check in with Haley, our chat moderator, and see if we're going to take a few questions right now before our break. So if you haven't already messaged your questions in the chat, feel free to do that now, and we'll check in with Haley and see if there's anything to cover.
Thanks. Hi, Olivia. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Perfect. Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I have sent out just a reminder to everyone in the chat box for questions. While we're waiting to see if any pop in, I will do a couple of administrative points. There was a request if the slides will be available. And we do plan to share the video of the training as well as PDFs of any materials we can. So we'll email that out to everyone. Everyone's enjoying this quote very much. So what a great screen to kind of end on. But so far, I don't see any questions coming into the chat box.
Okay. Maybe we'll give it another minute or two. And if not, we'll take a quick 10-minute break. And there will be other opportunities throughout if anybody thinks of questions in the interim.
So I've got a couple popping in. Has there been any movement to make racism an ICD-10 code since it contributes to disease? That's a great question.
That is an absolutely great question, and I am not aware of that movement, but I can imagine, especially as we know ICD-10 codes have expanded to include many social conditions for our patients, that could be the case. And particularly as we see cities and even Ohio is in the process of bringing this to the state legislature to declare racism as a public health crisis, that this could potentially follow. So nothing that I'm aware of at the moment, but I actually will look into that myself to see if there is anything brewing.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good kind of point and question. Anyone else, feel free to send in if you can find the chat box and send questions. I will say that we plan to keep our question list if there's anything we can't address live and in person, and share that with our presenters to post follow-up FAQs. So if you do have something that you want to send in privately, or if you think of it after today's presentation, we'll take those questions. I will pop in. Oh, we've got one more. Are you aware of any resources specific to children's services?
The children's services with regards to, I just want to make sure I'm clear on the question.
So we don't have other, but I'm thinking it might be someone related to job and family services or that sort of environment, maybe not just healthcare, but resources for others.
Sure. I think a lot of the resources that are available, particularly like racial equity tools, as well as I think the Stanford and the Georgetown sites have modules that go across fields. And so I think exploring those is really important. I was able, and obviously being a physician, kind of focused in on that a bit more, but I was able to see that there is quite a bit of research available also speaking to child protection reports and so forth. And we may hear some more of that from Dr. Leiker or Dr. Ahmad moving forward as well. But great question.
Thank you. All right, so Olivia, I don't see any other questions yet, but perhaps when we get started after the break, if anything's come in, I'll try to pop those up and share.
Sounds great. Then we're going to take a short 10-minute break, and we'll plan to be back at 2:25.